Picture the summer of 1789. The United States is barely 4 months old as a functioning government under its new Constitution. George Washington has been president for less than half a year. There is no Federal Reserve, no income tax, and barely a navy to protect the country's own merchant ships. The treasury is close to empty, drained by a Revolutionary War that cost far more than anyone had planned for. And the states, as they had already proven under the Articles of Confederation, are in no hurry to pay their share. So the first Congress, facing a government that could not fund an army or pay its debts, did something that would have seemed unthinkable 8 years earlier, when American colonists were dumping British tea into Boston Harbor over the exact same principle. They wrote a tax, one that fell on goods coming into American ports from overseas, rather than on the income or land of ordinary citizens. It was called the Tariff Act, signed into law on the 4th of July, 1789, 13 years after independence was declared. A nation born from a revolt against taxation without representation had just passed its own tax on trade, with full representation and full consent. That single law, quiet and procedural as it looked on paper, would set off a fight over money, sovereignty, and the structure of the Union itself, one that came close to tearing the country apart more than 40 years before the Civil War, most people think of as the moment it finally broke. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The man most associated with the Tariff Act of 1789 was Alexander Hamilton, though the bill was actually pushed through Congress by James Madison before Hamilton had even been confirmed as the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury. Madison's stated purpose was simple. The federal government needed revenue, and a tax on imported goods, collected at a handful of major ports by a small number of customs officers, was far easier to enforce than trying to tax thousands of scattered farms and workshops across 13 states, with no functioning federal bureaucracy to speak of. The rates were modest by later standards, averaging somewhere around 8.5% on most dutiable goods, and the law raised enough money that within its first year it covered nearly the entire operating budget of the federal government. But buried inside that first tariff was a second purpose that would matter far more in the long run. A handful of Pennsylvania manufacturers had lobbied for higher duties on specific goods they produced themselves, things like nails, glass, and certain textiles, arguing that American industry could never compete against cheaper British imports unless it had some protection while it got on its feet. Madison and the other framers of the bill agreed to modest protective duties on those items, and in doing so they planted a distinction that would define American politics for the next century. A tariff could be used two different ways. It could be a revenue tool, a tax collected simply to fund the government, kept low and broad so it did not distort trade too much. Or it could be a protective tool, a tax designed specifically to make foreign goods more expensive than domestic ones, shielding American manufacturers from competition, even if American consumers ended up paying more for it. Hamilton, once he took office, pushed hard toward the second vision. In his report on manufactures, submitted to Congress in December of 1791, he argued that the United States could never become a truly independent nation, free from reliance on European powers, unless it built up its own manufacturing base, and he argued that the government had every right to use tariffs, subsidies, and other tools to nurture industries that could not yet stand on their own. Congress did not adopt the full scope of Hamilton's plan, but the argument itself never went away. It split the country along a line that would only get sharper with time. The northern states, especially New England and the mid-Atlantic, were beginning to build textile mills, ironworks, and shipyards, and their merchants and manufacturers wanted tariffs high enough to keep British competition out. The southern states, by contrast, had built their economy almost entirely around exporting raw materials, first tobacco and rice, and increasingly, as the cotton gin spread after 1793, cotton. Southern planters bought most of their finished goods, from farm tools to fine cloth, either from Britain directly or from northern factories that were themselves protected from British competition by tariffs. A protective tariff, from a southern planter's perspective, did nothing to protect anything he actually produced. It simply made everything he had to buy more expensive, while doing nothing for the crops he sold overseas, and in some cases actively provoking the very trading partner, chiefly Britain, who bought his cotton. That tension sat mostly dormant for the first 2 decades of the Republic, a low hum beneath the louder political fights of the era, but it never disappeared, and every time Congress touched the tariff again, the hum got a little louder. The War of 1812 changed everything. For nearly 3 years, British naval blockades and American trade restrictions cut off the flow of manufactured goods from Europe almost entirely, and American manufacturers, suddenly free from foreign competition, expanded rapidly to fill the gap. factories sprang up across New England producing textiles, iron, and glass that had previously come from Britain. When the war ended in 1815, however, British manufacturers, sitting on warehouses full of goods and desperate to recapture the American market, began dumping their products into American ports at prices so low that domestic manufacturers could not compete. Entire mills that had been built during the wartime boom faced collapse within months. Congress responded in 1816 with a new tariff, and this one carried a different purpose than its predecessor. Where the Tariff of 1789 had been framed mainly as a revenue measure, the Tariff of 1816 was framed openly as protection, designed to keep the young industries that had grown up during the war from being strangled in their cradle by a flood of cheap British imports. It passed with support from lawmakers across the country, including a young congressman from South Carolina named John C. Calhoun, who at the time saw a strong manufacturing base as a matter of national security. It would not be the last time Calhoun's position on tariffs shifted dramatically. Over the next several years, a Kentucky congressman named Henry Clay built an entire political program around the idea of protective tariffs, calling it the American system. Clay argued that tariff revenue could fund internal improvements, roads, canals, and eventually railroads, tying the growing Western territories to Eastern markets and creating a self-sufficient national economy that depended less on trade with Europe and more on trade between American regions. It was an appealing vision for a young country still figuring out what kind of economic power it wanted to become, and for a while it commanded broad, if uneasy, support. But the uneasiness was already showing. Southern cotton growers watched British trade slow in response to American tariffs, warned that retaliation would cost them far more than any domestic factory was worth to the nation, and began to describe the American system as a wealth transfer from the agricultural South to the industrial North, one tariff bill at a time. By 1824, the fight had become openly sectional. When Congress debated a new tariff that year, raising duties again on iron, wool, cotton textiles, and a long list of other goods, the vote broke down almost entirely along regional lines. New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the newer Western states largely supported it. The South, with a few exceptions, opposed it almost unanimously. The bill passed anyway, and Southern representatives went home warning their constituents that the arithmetic of the Union was shifting against them. As new Western states joined the country, and Northern population grew faster than the South's share of votes in the House of Representatives kept shrinking. A region that had once helped write the rules of the tariff debate was beginning to realize it might soon have no power left to stop rules it did not like. That fear, more than any single dollar figure in any single tariff schedule, would end up driving the crisis that followed. The real stake was whether a shrinking political minority within the Union had any way to defend its own economic interests once it no longer held enough votes to win the argument outright, not merely the price of imported cloth. The breaking point came in 1828, with a bill that its own supporters privately admitted was designed to fail. That year, supporters of Andrew Jackson, then running for president against incumbent John Quincy Adams, controlled the Tariff Writing Committee in Congress, and their goal had less to do with trade policy than with political engineering. They drafted a bill with duties set so high and written so clumsily that it deliberately included tariffs harmful to New England's own shipping and textile interests, the region that supported Adams. The calculation was that New England congressmen, unwilling to vote for a bill that hurt their own industries, would join Southern opponents in voting the whole thing down, and Jackson's allies could then blame Adams and the North for killing tariff protection altogether, winning Southern votes in the coming election. It was a cynical piece of legislative theater, and it backfired completely. Enough New England representatives decided that even a badly written protective tariff was better than no protective tariff at all, and the bill passed in May of 1828 with some of the highest import duties in the nation's history. Southern politicians and newspapers had a name for it almost immediately. They called it the Tariff of Abominations. The numbers behind it tell their own story. Duties on raw wool climbed as high as 50%. Tariffs on iron, glass, and finished textiles landed well above 30% for many categories, at a time when tariffs supplied nearly the whole of the federal government's revenue. For a Massachusetts textile mill owner, those numbers meant a captive domestic market and rising profits. For a South Carolina cotton planter, they meant paying inflated prices for the plows, tools, and cloth his plantation depended on, while carrying the very real risk that Britain, angered by American trade barriers, might retaliate against the cotton crop that kept the state's economy afloat. South Carolina's cotton exports had already been sliding relative to newer, more fertile cotton lands opening up in Alabama and Mississippi, and planters watching their soil wear out and their political influence shrink, increasingly treated the tariff as the final insult on top of a slower, structural decline they were otherwise powerless to stop. Mass meetings broke out across the state. Local newspapers printed increasingly furious editorials. Some South Carolinians began openly discussing secession from the Union as early as the summer of 1828, a full 3 decades before it actually happened, and a word that had barely appeared in serious American political discourse began circulating through the state's political class with increasing frequency. Nullification. The man who gave that word its intellectual foundation was, improbably, the sitting Vice President of the United States. John C. Calhoun had spent the first part of his career as one of the most committed nationalists in Congress, a supporter of the Tariff of 1816 and an advocate for a strong federal government. By the late 1820s, watching his own state's economy buckle under a tariff system he had once helped build, Calhoun's political philosophy underwent a dramatic reversal. In the fall of 1828, working in secret because his position as vice president made open defiance of federal policy politically impossible, Calhoun anonymously wrote a lengthy pamphlet for the South Carolina legislature titled The South Carolina Exposition and Protest. In it, he laid out a theory of the Union that would define the next several decades of American constitutional argument. The Constitution, Calhoun argued, was a compact among sovereign states, each of which had voluntarily delegated specific, limited powers to the federal government, while retaining all the rest for itself, rather than a single national contract creating one indivisible people. If the federal government exceeded those delegated powers, passing a law a state believed was unconstitutional, that state had the right to declare the law null and void within its own borders through a special convention of its own citizens, the same kind of convention that had originally ratified the Constitution in the first place. This was the doctrine of nullification. Calhoun framed it as a peaceful, constitutional safety valve that let a state protect itself from federal overreach, well short of an actual call to leave the Union. His authorship of the exposition remained a closely guarded secret for years. Publicly, Calhoun continued to serve as vice president, first under John Quincy Adams, and then, after the 1828 election, under the man his allies had helped elect, Andrew Jackson. Privately, he had become the intellectual architect of a movement that would eventually put him on a direct collision course with the president he served under, a fellow Southerner and slaveholder who nonetheless held one political conviction with an intensity that surprised almost everyone. Andrew Jackson did not believe, under any circumstances, that a single state had the right to nullify federal law or threaten to leave the Union over it, and when South Carolina finally tested that belief directly, Jackson responded with a level of force that stunned even his own allies. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The clearest preview of what was coming played out publicly in January of 1830, 2 years before South Carolina actually attempted nullification, in a debate on the floor of the United States Senate that became one of the most famous in American history. Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina, speaking in defense of the ideas Calhoun had laid out anonymously in the exposition, argued that the states had never surrendered their fundamental sovereignty when they ratified the Constitution, and that a state retained the right to judge for itself whether a federal law was constitutional, and to refuse enforcement of that law within its own borders if it judged otherwise. Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster rose to answer him, and over the course of 2 speeches delivered across several days, Webster built one of the most quoted defenses of federal union ever given on the Senate floor. The Constitution, Webster argued, was the direct creation of the American people themselves, acting as a single nation, and not a compact between sovereign states that any one of them could interpret and nullify at will. The Supreme Court, and no individual state legislature or convention, held final authority over what the Constitution did and did not permit. He closed with a line that outlived nearly everything else said in Congress that decade, describing his hope for an America whose sentiment would be, in his words, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. The Webster-Hayne debate settled nothing legally. Nullification remained, for South Carolina's political leadership, a live and legitimate constitutional theory, regardless of what any senator from Massachusetts had to say about it. But the debate did something else. It put both sides of the argument on public record in the clearest terms either side had yet managed, 2 years before the theory would be tested for real, and it gave Andrew Jackson a preview of exactly the argument he would need to make when South Carolina finally acted. Jackson had watched the Webster-Hayne debate closely, and those close to him later said his own thinking on the Union's permanence hardened considerably in its aftermath, well before he ever imagined he would need to send warships to Charleston Harbor to make the same point with the United States Navy instead of a Senate floor speech. The rift between the president and his own vice president became impossible to ignore a few months later. at a Jefferson's birthday dinner in Washington in April of 1830. States' rights supporters had organized the dinner partly to rally support for nullification, and when the traditional round of toasts began, Andrew Jackson rose first. Looking directly at Calhoun as he spoke, Jackson raised his glass and offered a toast that would be repeated for generations afterward. "Our federal union," he said, "it must be preserved." Calhoun rose next, his hand reportedly trembling as he held his own glass, and offered a pointed reply. "The Union," he said, "next to our liberty, most dear." The exchange lasted only seconds, but everyone in the room understood exactly what had just happened. The uneasy alliance between the president and the man expected to succeed him had effectively ended in public, over 2 sentences about the meaning of the word union, 2 years before either of them would have to act on what they actually meant. By 1832, the pressure inside South Carolina had built for 4 straight years, and Congress, aware that something had to give, passed a new tariff intended to ease tensions. The Tariff of 1832 lowered some of the harshest rates from the 1828 bill, but it kept the core protective structure firmly in place, and for South Carolina's most committed nullifiers, a partial reduction was not nearly enough. In November of 1832, South Carolina called a special state convention, the same kind of body Calhoun had described 4 years earlier in the exposition, and delegates gathered in Columbia to put nullification into actual practice for the first time in American history. The convention passed the Ordinance of Nullification, a formal declaration that the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 were unconstitutional, null, and void within the borders of South Carolina, and that no state or federal official had any authority to collect the duties inside the state after the 1st of February, 1833. The ordinance went further still, declaring that if the federal government attempted to use force to collect the tariff or to coerce South Carolina into compliance, the state would treat that as an act of war and begin preparing to leave the Union entirely. South Carolina began organizing its own militia. State legislators authorized funds to arm and train volunteers. For the first time since the Constitution had been ratified, a state government was openly preparing for the possibility of armed conflict with the United States government over a law it considered illegitimate. What made the moment even more dangerous was how alone South Carolina actually was. Other southern states shared the same grievance against the tariff, and legislatures in Georgia, Virginia, and Alabama passed resolutions sympathizing with South Carolina's economic complaint. None of them endorsed nullification as the remedy. Some worried openly that a doctrine allowing any state to void any federal law it disliked would eventually be turned against slavery itself, an institution every one of those states depended on and had no interest in placing at the mercy of a legal theory that could just as easily run in the other direction. South Carolina found itself isolated at the exact moment it needed allies most, facing down the federal government with its own militia and little more. Andrew Jackson's response left no room for ambiguity. In December of 1832, he issued his proclamation to the people of South Carolina, one of the most forceful statements any American president has ever made about the nature of the Union itself. Jackson rejected Calhoun's compact theory outright, arguing that the Constitution had created a single, permanent nation rather than a loose alliance of sovereign states, and that no state had any constitutional right to nullify a federal law, let alone threaten secession over one. He warned South Carolina in language that left little to the imagination, declaring that disunion by armed force was treason, and that he would use whatever force was necessary to enforce federal law and preserve the Union intact. Privately, Jackson was reportedly even blunter, telling associates he was prepared to personally lead an army into South Carolina, and that any nullifier caught in open rebellion could expect to hang for treason. He was not bluffing about the military preparations either. Jackson moved to reinforce the federal garrison at Fort Moultrie and Charleston Harbor, ordered additional warships to patrol the South Carolina coast, and had a federal revenue cutter stationed offshore to intercept any attempt to block customs collection by force. He also asked Congress for explicit legal authority to use the Army and Navy to enforce federal tariff law if South Carolina followed through on its threat, and in early 1833, Congress passed what became known as the Force Bill, formally granting Jackson that authority. For a few tense weeks that winter, the United States military marching into an American state to put down armed resistance was a real and rapidly approaching possibility, rather than a hypothetical scenario confined to speeches in Congress, with federal troops and South Carolina militia both preparing for a confrontation that, had it happened, would have made South Carolina the flashpoint of a civil war roughly 28 years before the one that eventually came. A political compromise brought the crisis to an end, engineered, fittingly, by the same man who had spent the previous decade building the protective tariff system in the first place. Henry Clay, working alongside Calhoun, who had resigned the vice presidency at the end of 1832 to take a Senate seat from South Carolina so he could fight the battle directly in Congress, drafted a bill that would gradually reduce tariff rates over the following 9 years, bringing duties back down to roughly the levels of the more moderate 1816 tariff by 1842. The Compromise Tariff of 1833 passed Congress on the same day as the Force Bill, giving both sides something to claim as a victory. Jackson had the explicit legal authority to use military force if South Carolina refused to comply. South Carolina had a tariff that would eventually come down to levels its planters could live with. True to its schedule, the compromise brought rates down steadily for nearly a decade, only for Congress to reverse course again in 1842 and push protective duties back up almost as soon as the final reduction took effect, a reminder that no tariff settlement in this period ever stayed settled for long. In March of 1833, South Carolina's convention reconvened and formally repealed the Ordinance of Nullification, backing away from the immediate threat of armed conflict with the federal government. But the convention was not finished making its point. In a final, largely symbolic act of defiance, the same delegates who had just repealed nullification of the tariff turned around and nullified the Force Bill instead, a law that no longer had any practical reason to be enforced now that the crisis had passed, but one South Carolina wanted on record as unconstitutional regardless. It was a strange, almost theatrical way to end a standoff that had come close to armed conflict only weeks earlier, a state backing down from one confrontation while insisting it had lost none of the constitutional argument underneath it. No shots were fired, no soldiers marched. The Union held together, for the time being. The nullification crisis of 1832 and 1833 is often treated as a footnote in American history, overshadowed by the war that came 3 decades later, but the connection between the two events runs far more directly than most textbooks make it sound. Nearly every argument South Carolina made in 1832, that a state retained ultimate sovereignty over federal law within its own borders, that a shrinking political minority had the right to defend itself against a permanent majority through nullification, or if necessary, secession, that the Union was a voluntary compact states could exit if their fundamental interests were threatened, reappeared almost word for word in the secession conventions of 1860 and 1861. South Carolina was again the first state to act, seceding from the Union in December of 1860, less than 30 years after it had backed down from doing exactly that over a tariff bill. The issue driving secession the second time was slavery rather than trade duties, and the two issues were never as separate as they might first appear. The same argument Calhoun built to defend South Carolina's right to nullify a tariff it considered ruinous to its economy was, within a few years, being reused by Southern political leaders to defend the institution of slavery against federal interference, on the theory that if a state could nullify one federal law it disagreed with, it could nullify others, and if it could threaten secession over import duties, it could threaten secession over anything it considered an existential threat to its way of life. Calhoun himself spent the final 2 decades of his career refining and expanding the same states' rights arguments he had first developed during the tariff fight, applying them increasingly to the defense of slavery, until his death in 1850, a decade before the theory he built helped provide the constitutional justification an entire region used to leave the Union. Slavery caused the Civil War, directly and through decades of escalating political conflict that the tariff fight by itself never touched, and the nullification crisis deserves no credit or blame for that outcome on its own. What the crisis of 1832 did do was almost as consequential in its own right. It was a live rehearsal, a test run of secessionist theory, federal enforcement power, and the willingness of both a state government and a president to bring the country to the edge of armed conflict over a disagreement about federal authority. It showed political leaders on both sides exactly how far a state was willing to go, exactly how a federal government could respond, and which arguments would hold up under pressure and which would not. When South Carolina seceded again in 1860, it was following a script it had already written and tested once before, not improvising on the spot. The compromise itself set a pattern that American lawmakers would return to again and again whenever a tariff fight threatened to spin out of control. Rather than resolving the underlying disagreement about who tariffs were supposed to help, Congress learned it could buy time by phasing changes in gradually, giving both industries and their opponents years to adjust, rather than forcing an immediate winner and loser. The tariff question itself never fully disappeared from American politics either. Rates rose and fell for the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th, driven by the same underlying tension between industries that wanted protection from foreign competition and consumers and export-dependent producers who wanted cheaper trade. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, raising duties during the early years of the Great Depression, in a move most economists now believe deepened the global economic collapse rather than easing it. Tariff policy shifted dramatically after the Second World War toward freer trade, as the United States helped build a global trading system designed specifically to prevent the kind of retaliatory trade wars that had helped strangle the world economy in the 1930s. And in more recent years, tariffs have returned to the center of American political debate once again, as policymakers across the political spectrum argue over how much protection domestic manufacturing needs, how trade policy affects workers in different regions of the country, and how much authority the federal government should have to reshape trade relationships through executive action rather than through Congress. The specific numbers change, the technology being protected changes, but the underlying argument, first written into law on the 4th of July 1789 and nearly torn apart by it 44 years later, has never really gone away. Walk through any debate in Washington today over steel tariffs, semiconductor subsidies, or duties on foreign automobiles, and the shape of the argument has barely changed in 2 centuries. One side warns that without protection, entire domestic industries will wither under cheaper foreign competition. The other warns that the cost of that protection lands hardest on ordinary consumers and on export-dependent regions of the country that have little say in how the policy gets written. Congress still argues over who gets to decide, how much authority belongs to elected lawmakers and how much belongs to the executive branch, and whether a policy written to protect one region's industries ends up punishing another region's in the process. The country has not fought another armed standoff over a tariff bill since South Carolina backed away from the brink in 1833, and it likely never will again in quite the same way. But the underlying friction that put federal troops on alert in Charleston Harbor never disappeared. It simply moved from militia musters and naval blockades into courtrooms, trade negotiations, and congressional hearing rooms, where the same basic question Madison and Hamilton first wrote into law on the 4th of July 1789 is still being argued out one bill at a time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.